this was to less describe the neoliberal containment state, which I've done before, and more to try to get at the kind of economic developments, particularly in the last quarter of the 20th century, where we see the transition from the previous regime of containment under the welfare state to the neoliberal containment state. So it's picking up on Hugh's presentation in the sense of trying to talk about what the economic driver for containment is, not only I think you covered the kind of profiteering that happens off of people's misery, and that's an important dimension, but this is talking more about how does it support the overall process of exploitation under capitalism and imperialism. And so, like I said, I'm not going to get too into the descriptive, but we've talked about the rising number of prisons and incarceration in Canada, increasing numbers of police and private security, welfare, child protection, and social workers. So how all those institutions move less from the supportive aspects to whatever degree those actually existed, and increasingly towards the surveillance and punitive element, transportation and healthcare. So monitoring and criminalization and police and the transit system. There's a thing out here in Surrey about the whole number of times that border services has been called on people trying to access the healthcare system. The anti-gang and anti-terror legislation and how that's used to criminalize and contain whole communities, particularly poor communities and communities of color. And then, of course, the whole all of the policing that happens within the immigration system, which is all intensified under this containment state. That's just a funny slide about the Harper money that went into prisons, and then the picture of the massive Edmonton Remand Center, which was built in the last few years. And this is a VANDU poster that just illustrates the difference between the amount of money that the city of Vancouver spends on police versus the amount of money that they spend on housing. So this is the descriptive part. And, VANDU people at a police board meeting just talking about feeling targeted by the police. And the number of tickets that are handed out. So this has already been addressed, the way that people are really just criminalized for everyday activities within poor communities, and we call it mining for crime. So what's driving all this? What's driving this system of containment? So I'm going to talk first about the colonial dimension and second about the class or capitalist dimension. So the leading sectors of Canadian capitalism, which are historically and still arguably are resource extraction, transportation, and then finance, insurance, and real estate, which are kind of the corollary of how you finance big resource extraction projects, and then where those capitalists store all of their loot that they're making off of the looting of the land. So these rely on access to land and resources as a fundamental basic thing about the Canadian economy. And in order to ensure access to the land and to the resources, competing claims to those lands and resources have to be dealt with. And of course, in the case of colonial Canada, it's fundamentally about removing Indigenous people's claim to those resources. So Canadian colonial policy is designed to remove that competing claim to the land resources, and also to legitimacy in these spaces. And it's accomplished through two strategies under the Canadian state. So assimilation, which is the process of integrating Indigenous people into the mainstream Canadian class structure, but with no special claim to the land. And then extinguishment, which basically is based on extermination of Indigenous people, either eliminating them physically through genocidal policies or eliminating them as a people that are recognized as a people and would be able to have some kind of a claim to the land. So mass incarceration of Indigenous people supports both strategies. So it's a successor system to the residential school where people are ripped out of their communities and disconnected from that historical connection to the land and claim to the land and culture, so a kind of process of assimilation and cultural genocide. And then also just a strategy for extermination, so just removing people who are a barrier to the interests of Canadian capitalism into prisons. And you know, the consequence of incarceration is harms to your health, early mortality, disconnection from your community, all these kinds of things. So these are some of the slides from the presentations that I've done previously, just kind of illustrating that process of, especially of residential school, of mass incarceration of Indigenous people as a successor system to residential schools. So this is the children in residential school in Manitoba, and the numbers in residential schools peak in about 1931. This prison was built in 1930, or opened in 1931 in Manitoba, and by 1989, 56% of all the people in prison in Manitoba are Indigenous. By 2008, that had grown to 71%. So, you know, massive disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people. This is from the Native Women's Association of Canada. They say it's estimated that 40% of Aboriginal inmates in prisons today are residential school survivors. Many others are intergenerational survivors who've survived the child welfare system, including the 60s scoop and the legislative legacies of colonization. And we've talked about this before, the prison pipeline for Indigenous children and youth, and this is connected to like understanding it as a whole system of containment and not just when you get put in the can, right? First it's the social workers who are involved in child protection, you take kids away, and then the industry that's built around foster families and all the resources that go into that, group homes, and then finally into adult prison. And once you have a record, your life changes, right? So that's the colonial dimension, and then I want to talk about the class exploitation dimension. And this is going to get dry, guys, so this is where I'm maybe the presentation goes off the rails, but we'll see because I'm actually trying to connect it to the global transformations in the global political economy. So to break it down, basically capitalism is based on the exploitation of workers by capitalists, right? That's how our economic system works. The bosses pay you less than what the products of your labor are worth. And it's a system of exploitation, which naturally means people don't like to be exploited. They naturally fight back against exploitation, so there needs to be a way of containing and managing the discontent of those who are exploited in the system. And the system of containment is not static, it changes over time, and is going to be based on what the actual economic conditions and how organized people are, what the, all of these different factors. So this is what I'm trying to understand, is how the current system is different from the old system, and how they're the same in terms of being about containing people and making them exploitable by capitalism. So this is a picture from the rally today, with the call that Grassroots Women is putting out, which is they call over-policed and under-protected, and that really is a good short description of the transition from the welfare state to the neoliberal containment state, which is a switch from some degree of economic protections that were won under the welfare state where people could survive, being stripped away and replaced by policing forms of social control. And that's just a kind of pithy, everything is closed except for the prison door. So what I'm going to describe is a little bit of how that economic transformation takes place, going from the post-war Fordist economy to increasing global labor arbitrage, which is the idea that Hugh was talking about of capitalists moving their production elsewhere to exploit people at the cheapest possible rate. So this is what really drives the fundamental transformation in our economy and society, and what builds up this new police state that we're experiencing. So the way I think it through is global labor arbitrage, imperialist globalization, and the neoliberal economy.
What is arbitrage?
Arbitrage means like a process of looking for the cheapest possible source, competition. So it's global competition between labor, creating a global labor market. So what are the preconditions? So they existed pretty soon after the post-war period, which is why that like golden age of like industrial capitalism and the welfare state is such a short period, because pretty much as soon as it existed, they were already working at setting up the conditions for its dismantlement. So global financial institutions and stability, that's what you had under kind of US imperialist control of the world after the Second World War. Global communications and transportation infrastructure, which very quickly start being built up. That it's important to note that cheap transportation that we see is based on massive exploitation of fossil fuel resources, which we now understand is like a very short-term strategy, but that's actually part of what this whole global system is based on, and partly why it's so unsustainable and prone to crisis. Easy mobility of capitalism, so they set up these Bretton Woods financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF to create the possibility of mobility of capital. And then, of course, all of it is underpinned by what Hugh was talking about earlier, which is the fundamental reality that the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and Army are the guarantors of this world economic system. So then based on those underlying conditions, so capitalists are saying, yeah, I don't need to be tied to this particular state economy. I can go around the world searching for the cheapest possible labor and the highest profits. They start this process of imperialist globalization. That's basically the shorthand that I learned from the Philippines for imperialist globalization is liberalization, deregulation, and privatization. And it's imposed initially on countries of the global south through the IMF and the World Bank, odious debt, threats of economic isolation or direct intervention. And then it's extended into the north, and we saw it here brought in by initially the liberal governments of the 1970s started to pave the way with early privatizations of state enterprises. Then, of course, importantly, the free trade agreement under the Mulroney government, and finally the slashing of the basic redistributive programs under the Liberals in the 90s, which was done in a context of, I don't know if other people remember this, debt hysteria, like we're going to be so indebted, our economy's going to collapse, which of course is all nonsense. So the social context for the welfare state is this global mobility of capital, and the corollary, which is permanently high rates of unemployment where people just can't find meaningful work that they can survive on. So this is unemployment rates, and it only starts from the 1970s, but it's actually even lower if you go back to the 40s, and then you can see a kind of rising regular level of unemployment. And the question is, what do you do with the permanent large groups of people who are unemployed and out of work? So how do you force workers to accept a higher rate of exploitation? Well, they have to be afraid of what the alternative is, so you have to make unemployment a really increasingly punitive condition, which they've done through cutting EI and welfare rates and increasing the policing component of that and undermining the redistributive component. For those who do have jobs, there's increasing policing by their bosses, since they're less likely to be invested in the successes of enterprises, because they're not seeing that, oh, I'm in this job for life, I should, really be part of the team or whatever. Nobody's feeling that anymore, so increasingly workplaces themselves have to be policed and controlled. And ideologically, the growing numbers of, and this is part of the dynamic in our neighborhood for sure, is that poor people have to be seen as the problem and not a symptom of a systemic problem, right? So this has always been the case under capitalism, that that poor people are painted as being lazy and that they're criminal or whatever, innately criminal, that they're the problem. That's really ramped up, I think, in the last few years under the neoliberal containment state.
There's a lot of talk here about it's drug addiction and mental
Yeah.
health that's causing
Yeah,
homelessness
exactly.
in Surrey,
Yeah.
as if it's not gentrification of
Yeah.
homelessness.
Yeah. And again, talking about drug addiction and mental health as kind of personal failings or inadequacies rather than the outcomes of other systemic factors. So what we shouldn't fight for is a return to the welfare state. So it's important, like in framing this as like a negative transition from a less repressive to a more repressive state. One of the responses could be, okay, well, let's just fight for the good old days when. So things weren't actually that great in the good old days. It's important to understand that that moment in time was built on a really, really intense exploitation and plundering of the global south of the oppressed nations. So we don't want our comfort to be built on the exploitation of others. That it was a product of a particular historical conjuncture, so there's no indication that the welfare state is on offer anymore. I don't hear the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star or any big corporate media saying, yeah, we could go back to the good old days where we had decent, you could get decent unemployment insurance, and when nobody's talking about a national housing program or it's not. The reality is it's not on the table, and the ruling class that constructed the welfare state was recovering from 50 years of intense crisis and 2 world wars and revolutions following the Depression and militant labor organizing. They were scared of a revolution. That's why they were willing to offer that. So that's important to keep in mind, that the workers who won those small concessions from capitalism to make life more bearable weren't actually fighting for concessions. They were fighting for the whole pie largely. They were revolutionaries, and that's why we got something out of it. So what we should fight for, I think I didn't finish this slide, but that's good enough. Those 2 points are good. So liberation and self-determination for Indigenous people, so getting to that colonial component, and that for the rest of us, for the rest of the oppressed and exploited masses within Canada, that would be such a blow to the basic Canadian capitalism that it would create the conditions for actually putting a better future and a more real economy that worked for all of us on the table. So we should definitely always be in solidarity with that. And then talking about real democracy, and especially about economic democracy, which is actually the critical component that we're not seeing. Being able to go and cast a ballot every few years is not helping us in terms of our daily survival. The thing that really needs to be called into question is, why are these people so rich and powerful and controlling the whole economic political system, and why are we totally frozen in? That's it.
Good.